Hello, everyone. This is episode 12 of Gaming's Lost Memories. I'm your host, BigReed, and today we are going to be talking about Sonic the Hedgehog. And this is going to be a tricky one because I feel like I need to like vent and complain a little bit about Sonic. And I love the series. So, kind of what I want to focus on is, how Sonic came about, my early experiences with it, the impact it had on the gaming industry, uh, and then the transition to 3D, the Sonic cycle, which um, I feel like I need to like talk about it because it's I don't know, just an interesting concept that I felt was true for a while, but I feel like that's kind of changing and kind of like currently where Sonic is now, where I really do believe that like Sonic has a very devoted, oh my goodness, a devoted and interesting fan base, where there's just diehard Sonic fans. They get into like they'll talk about like lore stories, like there's a lot of Sonic fan fiction and like other weird stuff out there, but Sonic just resonated with a lot of people, like myself included, and it still does to this day. But I, what kind of prompted me to talk about Sonic today was I was watching a streamer. He normally streams Pokemon, so I was like, oh, he's streaming Sonic Frontiers, the new game that just came out, which is an open world take on Sonic, which sounds like it could be very captivating because Sonic, I don't really think Sonic has ever made the transition to 3D like effectively yet, and the series has already had numerous like 3D titles. It seems like for whatever reason with Sonic in particular in the platforming style of Sonic, it just struggled to transition to 3D like Mario has, or a lot of the other franchises that from years and years ago kind of went through that 2D to 3D jump and have continued on to like reinvent and revitalize themselves. Um, but when I really look back at this, and before we kind of really get started with some history here, I I think we're kind of getting to a point, and this is gonna sound crazy because tomorrow's my birthday. I'm about to be 35, which that sounds like, oh my goodness. I don't feel this old. I think, um, but certain franchises that I feel like are like the big ones. Like I remember one time in high school, we had like an art project, and we were doing it on these like thick pieces of like cardboard paper where it was like really absorbent to ink. So like I used like different colored inks, and I did like all the gaming logos at the time. So like all of them. There's probably like 50 plus like logos, either video game logos or video game companies and everything like that. And like I look back to that time, and maybe Sonic is just not as big and important as I think it is. Because for me, it's like, oh, this is a franchise that has completely like shaped kind of me as a person in my younger, more formative years, and is just like huge and impactful and it is to a certain degree because the Sonic movies came out. My kids love them. I think they're okay. You know what I mean? Like they could have been better, but I thought they were enjoyable movies that kind of captured Sonic pretty well. It was goofy, it was fun, but it's just like, is Sonic the Hedgehog as a video game series still like a quote unquote like triple A huge title? And like I look at the sales figures of recent games because to be honest, I haven't kept up with like Sonic the Hedgehog sales figures. In my mind, it was significantly more popular than what the sales figures are showing. And I know sales aren't everything, but Mario Odyssey sold like what 20 million copies or some 50, however many, millions and millions and millions of copies. And I just kind of assumed over the last like 10 plus years, 10 or 15 years that Sonic the games have been releasing and selling like 5 or 10 million copies, and that's just not the case. Since the original Sonic the Hedgehog, which came out on the Genesis, which it was bundled in with the Genesis, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But if you count the bundled sales, it was 15 million. Sonic 2 was like 7 million, and then basically, you know, since the original Sonic the Hedgehog, the best selling Sonic the Hedgehog game is actually Sonic and Mario in the Olympic titles. Like for whatever reason, the the first one that came out was really popular apparently. Um, so yeah, that's kind of odd that since Sonic's inception, the best-selling Sonic game is like a Mario tie-in. I don't even know what kind of game, like sports game, that you would call that as. But so what's the history of Sonic, and why is it so influential, and why is it why do you have fans who have played it forever like myself, like kind of like scratching their head when they see like where Sonic is now? So Sonic the Hedgehog was designed to be Sega's mascot. So they needed to sell Sega Genesis, systems, and they looked at Nintendo. Well, they looked at kind of two companies mainly, but Nintendo has a mascot of Mario, and that has not changed. Like it's just been absolutely crazy that I remember sitting down playing my NES and playing Mario, and now watching the younger generations play Mario on like the Nintendo Switch. It's like, what? Whoa. And it's still good. It's still really popular. Still sells like crazy. It's still really well known. So that's all interesting. But that's where Sega was coming out. Like, hey, we need that. Like, we need to sell these systems, and we need some type of mascot that differentiates us from Nintendo, but kind of gives us a killer app or a killer title to sell this system and help us market this stuff better. But it also has to be a good game. And they also looked at Disney. So, Mickey Mouse. I hope this is correct because I've always heard this. But they looked at Mickey Mouse and they're like, okay, so like, how do we kind of make a character that does what Mario does for Nintendo for us, but also is we want it to be brand recognition when you see this character, similar to when you see Mickey Mouse, you think of Disney. It's just Mickey Mouse, Disney. Everybody knows Mickey Mouse. Mickey Mouse has been around forever. So they ended up doing that. They created Sonic the Hedgehog, and they created this super interesting time for me, but for the gaming industry too, because Sonic, he was edgy. Like he represented the '90s, I think. Like I don't know why the '90s had this like weird like attitude era. Like it was just goofy. But I feel like Sonic kind of encapsulated it pretty well. And Sega did a good job of, making him look edgy, where Mario kind of looks, friendly, doesn't really talk outside of saying like wahoo and stuff. Sonic has that edgy look. He's really fast. It helped them market their campaign of Sega does what Nintendo don't, and blast processing, which was like the processor, apparently, like the blast processing processor, quote unquote, of the Sega Genesis was like the only thing that Sega had over Nintendo in terms of performance against the Super Nintendo, but they marketed that like crazy. Like I remember being a kid and just getting like blasted with, advertisements, basically watching commercials and like seeing like cool toys and video games and everything. But I just remember I'm like, Sonic is cool. Like I like this. And then the Super Nintendo is like, this is like so embarrassing, but it like worked on me as a very young kid. Like the Super Nintendo was like your grandmother's console. It was like, all right, we got the Nintendo. Uh, Looking back, the Super Nintendo is arguably the greatest console of all time and has some like the best games of all time. But also one thing that it represented as well was Nintendo during the time. they they would censor games at that time. Now they've changed a lot recently, basically because they've had to. That's a different podcast. But Final Fantasy VI had censored scenes, or three, Final Fantasy III, same thing. Three is six here, but they censored scenes and everything like that. And Sega took the opposite approach. It's like, boom, here's this. This is like an adult gaming console. This is like the cool, edgy gaming console. Look at our character. He's fast, as opposed to this like, chubby character that runs around and jumps. Like, that's slow, like platforming. Like, it's gonna be super fast platforming. And the games were awesome. The Genesis games, sadly, for whatever reason, Sega themselves as a developer, and we'll talk about this, but I don't know if they lost the coding. I don't know if they lost the coding or the files of the original Sega Genesis games, or Sonic team and the people that basically like created Sonic and everything like that, they're no longer with Sonic Team or Sega. So I don't know if it's like from that, but they've just never been able to get back to the positives of Sonic. What are the positives of Sonic? The music's absolutely phenomenal. The gameplay is really fast. Sonic's a cool character. The levels just look amazing. They're like really, really awesome looking, and you have like a more arcadey type experience as opposed to Mario, where Mario is more detailed platforming where you might be a lot slower and meticulous with your moves. Where Sonic, you're exploring the levels. A lot of the levels will have like multiple routes, like higher, lower. There's secrets. Like I just bought into all of it. I freaking absolutely love Sonic. And I remember because money was tight growing up, and I really do think my mother, did the absolute best that she could with Christmases and everything like that. And I really appreciate that looking back. But I remember we went to Ames, which is a dead department store in the small town that I grew up in. It no longer exists. It went out of business like 100 million years ago. But I remember, and I look back now as a parent, and I'm like, okay, I realize what she was doing. But she took me to their electronics department, and as I recall, they actually had a good video game department. Like I remember, like I have a few memories of it, and it was better. Like I don't think our small town deserved like how good it was, and we definitely didn't appreciate it because basically after Ames shut down, there's no place to buy electronics in that town. But I remember she took me there, and I have a very vague memory of this. But the one thing that stuck out is she was basically trying to like walk me around to see like what I wanted for Christmas. And I kind of knew our situation as a kid growing up. So like I'm weird about gifts. I don't like receiving gifts because I feel bad that, in those types of situations it might have really stretched us thin, or like sometimes it wasn't possible. You know what I mean? So this year it was, and she's walking me around, and I remember she goes up to like the Super Nintendo and she's like, "Is this something you would like?" And I said, "Yeah," because I did not like feeling like greedy. Like I didn't want to be like, "No, Sonic's awesome and Sega's cool, Nintendo's lame." But I remember I said yes, but I think I said yes in like a sad kid way. So I was like, yes, and like tilted my head down. Looking back, I would have loved to have had a Super Nintendo. I mean, now especially too, that'd have been great. But I don't think she asked, um, like if I wanted the Sega Genesis. I think she just saw my reaction, and one of two things happened. Either she picked up on it and was like, okay, he clearly doesn't like this one, so maybe a different one. Or there was just like this amazing mega Sega Genesis deal at the time. So long story short, you go to Christmas Day, and of course she has like the VHS giant camcorder, busted out, and somewhere there's a VHS of young BigReed like opening his Christmas present, and it was a Sega Genesis, and I remember like seeing it and just being so shocked, and I started getting teary eyed. So I remember I held the box up in front of my face because I was like embarrassed that I was like starting to cry. And there was like a few games that I got and everything like that too. One of them was Garfield. I don't know why I remember Garfield, like why that was a game, but hey, we had Garfield. But I just remember like I was so excited and so happy, that I got that as a present. It was the best. And the rest is history. Like, not only do I think the Sega Genesis was a really solid console, Sonic 3 ended up being one of my favorite games ever. So, Sonic the Hedgehog, the original one, I still think it's a solid game. I think the like graphics look really cool. I think the gameplay's solid. Sonic didn't have his spin dash yet, and I don't think Tails was in it either. So the spin dash was a huge, like if you started with two and you go back to one and then you realize you can't spin dash, you're like, what the heck? But there's so many like iconic levels and everything like that. A really solid game. Sonic the Hedgehog 2 is arguably the best Sonic game. I think it, having played all of the Genesis ones and the ones that kind of after that, and a few of the other, like a lot of the 3D titles too. I think if somebody said Sonic 2 is my favorite, even though Sonic 3 is my favorite, like I wouldn't argue, because not only do you have Tails, the game's super long, the levels are incredible, the games are fun. There's like so much to like you're running through the levels quickly and exploring, but they they're very atmospheric, which is really crazy to say because you're running to the right really fast. You know what I mean? Like there's less of a focus on battling where like, in Mario you can run through everything, but you'll take your time to like, knock out some Koopas or something like that. But in Sonic, you're blazing through everything, you know what I mean, and running fast because if you get hit once, you lose all your rings, you get hit again, you're dead. But you're not really stopping to like hit all of the enemies, or you're running really fast, getting thrown into the air, and then you're like, bouncing off of the enemies and knocking them out to like further progress yourself and like keep your speed going. The Chaos Emeralds are in it too. I don't recall if Super Sonic is in Sonic 1, but I know he's in 2 and 3, and Knuckles too, which is another fun thing to kind of talk about. But Sonic the Hedgehog 2 is just it's awesome. It's Sonic in all of his glory. The gameplay is really tight, the jumping is tight, like everything feels very concise and just clean. Like the gameplay is good, the graphics are awesome, the music's awesome, the levels are cool. Like collecting all the emeralds, like there's all those like the side mini games that collect the Chaos Emeralds. The boss fights are pretty cool. You get to the end of a level, Robotnik comes out in some crazy machine. You have to, be careful like how you hit them because like they'll have moments where they're kind of vulnerable. But that's also kind of one of the interesting thing about early Sonic boss fights is they can be kind of tricky. Because I remember like the end of Sonic the Hedgehog 3, the final boss, like you basically go into it and have to not get hit once. Because I think you can get 3 rings before you go into it, but he has like a tiny little hitbox that you have to hit while jumping and like moving in the air and like angling it. Now I can do it because I played those games like so many times, but I remember it being like really hard the first few go arounds. But Sonic the Hedgehog 2, awesome. Sonic 3 comes out. Now, the Genesis version of Sonic the Hedgehog 3 is amazing. And Michael Jackson, out of all people, like they gave they gave Sonic red shoes because of Michael Jackson. Like what they were trying to accomplish with Sonic as a mascot was just like literally like coolness. You know what I mean? But Michael Jackson apparently worked on Sonic the Hedgehog 3, and this has pretty much been confirmed at this point. But there's a lot of like lore and like rumors behind this one because basically what happened is Sonic the Hedgehog 3 was going to be a game with Knuckles in it. So Knuckles is in Sonic 3, but I don't think he was playable. But basically they introduced a save system. So that took up too much memory on the cart basically. And they had to tighten the game down and split it across Sonic the Hedgehog 3 and Sonic and Knuckles. So both games are extremely, extremely similar. Just a lot of different levels. I do feel like they feel a lot different. Like I feel like Sonic 3, I think it has 6 levels, but they feel different than when I play Sonic and Knuckles. Like when I play Sonic and Knuckles, I'm like, this is kind of strange feeling. I don't know. I don't know if it's the music or like just the level design. I just feel like Sonic 3, I really like the levels and the transitions between the levels. But the music is absolutely incredible. So I want to say the levels 4 through 6, they no longer include the original music in any of the reboots, remakes, or like HD ports or anything like that. Which leads me to believe, or leads like everybody to believe that there's a lot of legal issues surrounding the Michael Jackson thing because he helped work on it, and I don't know how else to say it. Especially like level 6 in Sonic 3, it just sounds like Michael Jackson music, but I think one thing that he didn't like is because he was a very particular person musically, and a lot of other reasons why. But musically, he didn't like the sound chip of the Genesis, which is true. Like it just if you compare it to like an album, like a album you're going to release to video game music at the time, you were limited. You weren't going to get the same experience if you're trying to say like, okay, I want to release like a regular song and I want it to sound like that. It's just, it wasn't possible at the time. Not saying that early video game music wasn't great. It was phenomenal. Just for like what Michael Jackson was trying to do, it wasn't feasible at the time. So I don't know what the truth is because anytime I look this up, I get kind of conflicting answers. But it's enough for Sega to not want to use that music anymore. So, either something happened or, his influence is in those songs. Because basically during the allegations, with all of that, which we won't get into too much here, they basically like dropped him working on it and released it. But it sounds like, his influence and work is probably still in the game music. Then you have Sonic and Knuckles, right? Now, here, Sega got weird with the Genesis. This is where things started getting a little strange, and I feel like Sega started losing its way, but, you know, because Sega was losing its way, Sonic started losing his way too. But Sonic and Knuckles had a cartridge where you could open up the top and put another Sonic game, which I think technically any game. I've never did that, but you could put another Sonic game in it and control Knuckles through like original Sonic games. I remember as a kid, I had Sonic 1 through 3. I did not have Sonic and Knuckles, but my friends did. So like I would take like Sonic 3 over and like we'd play them together. But there were secret parts in levels to Sonic 3 that only Knuckles could access. So what you had to do was like play as Knuckles, go to that part, and like he could use his Knuckles to like break through rocks and stuff. So it's pretty fascinating, being like bringing it there and like you're just like stacking all the games on top of each other and like switching them out and stuff like that. It was pretty cool as a kid, but an odd concept, and it led to an odd concept of I think Sega, the Genesis at one point, especially in North America, like everything that Sega tried to do with Sonic, like making him cool and getting market share away from Nintendo by having a mascot worked. Um, like at one point, the Genesis was outselling the Super Nintendo in North America. I don't know if it was overall, but I definitely know like in North America. Um, but that was basically working. The Genesis was popular, and as opposed to looking towards the future and ensuring that they were, basically ready to transition into new hardware and everything like that, as you're making games for the existing hardware, they got kind of stuck trying to get the most out of the Genesis hardware, or maybe even trying to like reinvigorate the market, because there was a 32X attachment which played like a different set of games. And then there was like a Sega CD, which had different. It was just it was a weird time because I think they let the Genesis hang around too long. And as a video game company, if you're creating hardware, you always have to basically be working on the new hardware and at least having ideas for it, because you're doing two things. You have to take care of your, the existing time frame, creating new content, making sure that all of your studios are effectively working on, quality games, the inspection of the quality, always having things in the pipeline as a business. But then for the future too, like if you have, it's changed a lot, but the console cycle used to be like 5-ish years or so, like 5-6 years or so. Being ready to release that new hardware to keep pushing the video game industry forward, but also working on new software for that hardware as well. And this is where things kind of, started getting a little weird, not only for the Sonic franchise, but for Sega as well. Um, Too much time on the Genesis, basically. You know what I mean? Like releasing other attachments, super confusing from a consumer standpoint. Because it's like, okay, how do I buy games from your company? Because it seems like I got my Sega Genesis and there's like 6 attachments. There's 3 different styles of game. Like, how do I know? Like, what's going on? It's good that they were like pushing the boundaries by having like a CD platform attaching to it. It's an interesting concept, but I think at the same point, like you need to be ready to develop your hardware properly and have that ready to go as well. Now, also at this time, I was a just big Sonic fan in general. They had like the TV show, which was totally cool. Um, the Scholastic Book Fairs, which I don't know if everyone remembers. Basically, the Scholastic Book Fair would come to your school and I don't know if it was for a few nights, but like you'd go to your school, like after school, like between like around like six, between like 6 and 7 or whatever it was, and they would have like this thing rolled out of like all these books, and you could go through and like it was just so fun. There were so many different books, but there were Sonic the Hedgehog books, and you are darn right that I like bought them. I was like I think maybe in first grade. Uh, I think I'm trying to think here. Yeah, it would have been first grade, I believe. Um, it would have been like what 95 something first or second grade. I think it was first grade because I remember I don't know if she's still around, but Mrs. Shirts. I just remember her because she had a weird name like Shirts. We didn't know how to spell Shirts when we were like writing her name on the board one time, and like we just drew a T-shirt. But Scholastic Book Fair would come around, and I had like two or three Sonic the Hedgehog books and a couple Donkey Kong books too. And it would like it was a short book, big lettering, pages with Sonic art describing like what was happening in the book. So like you turn the page and there's like Sonic, like I don't know, but they told the origins of Sonic, and him and Robotnik were brothers, adopted brothers, like his grandpa. I don't know. It was like such a weird situation. Everything about Sonic's a little weird, but I was all on board. I freaking love Sonic. I remember just like anything Sonic related, I was like super interested in. So, oh, the Tiger handhelds too. Those little game systems that you would get. They were wow, the most confusing things ever. So they look like a square little game system, and they have like a directional pad on the left, and then on the right they have like an action button or like different buttons. But I remember I had a Sonic 2 one. Really vague memories of this, but I looked it up, and I was like, that's the one, because there's three of them, three Sonic ones, one based off of each of the Sonic 1, Sonic 2, Sonic 3. But I saw the Sonic 2 one, and I beat it. I don't even know how I did that, because like I was watching somebody play it earlier today, and it is unbelievably confusing of what the heck is even going on in the screen. But I was like so pumped to have it, and I was like ready to just play that thing, and I beat it somehow. Like I remember it had a button where you could turn the sound off, because like the music was so sharp on your ears and just like hilariously bad. But those things are a cool find. I think you can still buy them. I think they started like manufacturing them again. But I remember I had Sonic the Hedgehog 2 on the Tiger Electronics, and like I even beat that. Like I just freaking love the franchise. Now, during this time, next generation of consoles is coming out, and a lot of things changed with Sega, and I really think that's kind of, what has led to Sonic in his current state. But Sega, they're going to release their Sega Saturn, and boy, did they do it weird. But it was going to compete against the PlayStation 1 and the Nintendo 64. One thing that I read a lot during the time, and I should have checked the specs before I started this, but I think it was a difficult platform to develop for. And I don't know if it was like less powerful than, I think it was less powerful than the 64, but I don't know about the PlayStation. But the popularity of the Sega Saturn was just kind of depressing. Now, I have extremely fond memories of it. I still have a Sega Saturn, and my buddy had one. So that was like the console that they had at the time. I don't quite know why, but I do believe it could play CDs. So I don't know if like his parents got it for that reason, because I remember like they would have like parties and stuff, and like it was basically like go drink Kool-Aid and eat pizza, and you guys play video games and let the adults just party. But I remember them putting like a CD in and playing it through like the TV speaker system, or like whatever speakers they had attached to it. But I loved the Sega Saturn. Now it didn't have, from my understanding, like a traditional full-fledged like 3D Sonic game. And this is where it was weird too. Sonic 3D Blast released on the Genesis. I don't know if it was also on the Saturn. That was just a really weird, bizarre game. Like everything, like it just started. It went from holy crap, these games are pretty awesome, and people being like Mario's a dork, to what? Like everything with Sega and Sonic, everybody's like tilting their head to the side and scratching their head. But I remember playing like Virtual Cop 2, Virtual On, which was like a robot 3D, I think it was 3D, semi 3D like fighting game. Like it had so many cool games. Like I remember going to my friend's house and just having a blast with this console. but they ghost dropped it. So basically, I think they announced it and then they were just like, oh, it's out next month. It's like, what? So like there was no hype. It was a super bizarre launch. Like normally, you're giving plenty of time. Like you might there's going to be a lot of information like even now, up until the point, and there's probably going to be like an official announcement and date, even if it's like a couple months out, like hey, it's November 17th, blah 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 blah, like whatever day it is. But it just seemed like it was like Sega Saturn, oh yeah, by the way, it came out last week. Like what? Like what just happened here? So it was a really weird release. And Sony came into the marketplace with their weird, Nintendo PlayStation that them and Nintendo basically like fought over, and Sony's like, well, we'll just release it ourselves then, fine. So it was just a really odd and competitive time, and gaming was transitioning into 3D. And I think this is kind of where there's like almost a point of no return, because so many people that have been playing Sonic since the original times of the Genesis games, or have been just playing video games for like a really long time, look back to that Genesis era of like the golden age of Sonic, right? And for some reason, with this 3D transition, Sega's just never been able to figure it out. Even Sonic Adventure. So what happened is Sonic Team is like, hey, we're gonna push development back of the Sonic game that we're working on, because Sega was like, hey, the Sega Dreamcast, or excuse me, the Sega Saturn is dead. Like this just didn't work out, so we're gonna release a new console, which is another weird thing, because it's like, okay, hey, this Sega Saturn didn't work out. They just like pulled the plug on it, which is like crazy to kind of like think of. And pretty soon they were going to have to do it again. But the Sega Dreamcast was way ahead of its time. So, you have great graphics for the time. And it was stuck in the weird place of being in between the, sixth and seventh generations. Like, I think it's technically, I don't know. I don't know if it's like, it feels like 6.5. But I don't know what generation the Dreamcast is technically a part of. I want to say seventh. But that was the other weird thing, is it felt like it was kind of in between them, because if you look at some of the early Sega Dreamcast games, I get Nintendo 64 vibes on a lot of them. But then again, the console had a 56K modem, so there was a lot really interesting about the console. So Sonic Team's like, okay, we know this is coming out. We're just gonna push our development past this with it. So you have this weird time where Sonic's just on hiatus. Sega releases, a bomb of a console, and now they're like, okay, we gotta bring Sonic back. We gotta bring our company back, basically, release new hardware, and that led to Sonic Adventure. Now, I feel like this is a pretty not polarizing but divisive title, I think, in my opinion. So a lot of people like it. It sold well, and when I say well, this is where Sonic, I think, really starts to differentiate from like when I say triple A, you can reference that a lot of different ways, like high budget, or high sales or something like that, generally like higher budget. But this is kind of where, like, it was the Dreamcast's best selling game, I believe, but it was like 2.5 million copies. Now, when you're used to Nintendo cranking out, like, you just like look at the Nintendo Switch sales of their first party franchises, and it's ridiculous. Like Mario Kart 8 has sold 40 million copies, and it wasn't even originally released on the Switch. But 2.5 million copies, like, that's not bad. But you kind of already see, like, it was released on a failed console too, so like I feel like I have to give it some credit there. But it got good reviews, especially at the time. And once again, the Dreamcast was just cool. Like, I didn't feel like the PlayStation 2 was cool at the time. Like, at the time it launched. It was definitely, it felt more like a piece of technology, where the Dreamcast had the feeling and marketability of like an actual game console, like a cool game console. And then the GameCube was purple and had a purse handle. And listen, I love my GameCube. But it was also ahead of its time. Like, I can't believe the Dreamcast had Phantasy Star Online. Like, it had a small scale MMO with a 56K modem, and like, it's just amazing. Phantasy Star Online. The original is like one of my favorite games ever too. I played it a ton on the GameCube. It was just like get off of school and go and be like, okay, time to kill some random shark monsters, I guess, whatever they are. But I remember playing Sonic Adventure, and just to be frank, I don't think it's a very good game. I don't think it's bad, but Sonic has never experienced the 3D Sonic game that just had critical acclaim and sold really well and like became known as like, okay, boom, you made the transition. You know what I mean? And there's so many franchises, one, that didn't even survive the transition of 3D gaming during this time. And then there's other franchises that seem to have done it well, and then others that just like didn't do it too well and since have like rectified it. But Sonic in particular, for whatever reason, the really fast gameplay worked well on 2D, probably because there's less space to work around. Like you can basically hold right on the joystick or the joystick, the D-pad, and kind of get where you're going and react to it. But it just never felt tight. Like the gameplay, the controls, the action, it just never kind of felt the same. Now, from like an overall atmospheric perspective, I think Sonic Adventure and the Dreamcast in general just was really cool. Like the opening the opening level, I feel like in Sonic Adventure also kind of sets a tone for the game, and then it gets kind of like weird after that. You're like running really fast, you're like flying through, like all this crazy stuff's happening on the screen, and then all of a sudden the camera goes in front of you. So, and that's the other thing is the camera shifts around, so then you have to like if you change the direction of the joystick at the time, it's just very confusing because when you're running one way, then all of a sudden the camera goes in front of you. You're like pushing the opposite direction that you're going on screen now. So that was just like another weird thing. Like I don't think they ever figured out the camera in the Sonic Adventure games. There's two of them, but you're running away. Then there's an orca whale, and it's like just jumping up and crashing this boardwalk as you're running away from it. And it's like, whoa, this is awesome. Like the Dreamcast is cool. Sonic's cool again. Mario's a dork. Like this is amazing. And it was like it was really cool. Then I don't remember what happens at that point, but you all of a sudden you're like in a town or like a city street, and there's like taxis, and you're like, what? Did I get off on the wrong bus stop? Like what is going on here? Then all of a sudden it's like really weird. There's open world like hubs and stuff like that. But that's just like when the game gets weird at that point, because then you have to like go and like find the other levels, and oh, there's other playable characters. This is another thing in Sonic fandom where some people are like, I love Big the Cat and all these weird side characters. And other people are like, why are these side characters here? I just want to go fast. Like, please let me just go fast. Um, so Sonic Adventure was a weird experience. Sonic Adventure 2 came out, and it was like one of the last hurrahs for the console because the Sega Dreamcast didn't survive. And there was a gentleman, I don't have his name off the top of my head, that basically was financing a lot of Sega's business. And on his deathbed, he forgave Sega of all the remaining debt. And the Dreamcast is kind of like a sad time. There's a few times in like gaming history where everything's very quiet and solemn and sad. Like the merger of Square Enix, or excuse me, Squaresoft, and like that was one of them. I remember that happening, and like all the weirdness with the movie and everybody just being like, wow, like Squaresoft's gone. You know what I mean? Like this is an interesting time. And everything that happened with the Sega Dreamcast, like all of the people at Sega, the developers of the games, and I really feel like Sega gave it, I think they knew this was it. And it's really difficult when it's a business. And I feel like sometimes the video game industry starkly reminds us of this, that you got to sell widgets, or you got to sell games, right? If you don't have the revenue, you can't make more games. And games are art, aren't they? So it's kind of weird. Like I always think about this. It's always strange that like our art form that we love solely the longevity of it is based upon can they continue selling copies of new games. And Sega just couldn't deal with all of the external pressure. So they lost the EA deal, the EA Sports deal. And I cannot remember why. I think it was because their 2K Sports Series, which was awesome and probably honestly better than, EA's, I don't even know what it is, Madden series. They're based. Uh, I might get some hate on this one, but they're basically the same freaking game every year. Um, so I don't know. I love football, but I just feel like Madden never really made me feel like I was playing football or like watching exciting football. But Sega, obviously they wanted to have their 2K football games, their NFL, games on the console, and EA was just like, well, fine. We're not really, and Madden was just wildly popular during that time. The PlayStation 2 was also, I don't want to say an unforeseen juggernaut, but I don't think everybody expected the situation that occurred with the seventh generation. And I guess technically you have four consoles. You have the Dreamcast, GameCube, Xbox, and PlayStation 2. Sony, once again, and, they're big on, the physical media, like the actual, so you have your, DVD. It had a DVD drive, right? It's crazy to think that, like, home DVDs, like, weren't popular yet. I think it was, like, basically the Matrix that kind of was the catalyst for that whole market. But from a technological standpoint, Sony banked on that, and that just that's another thing that helped edge out the Dreamcast. There was so much competition, and the competition, at the end of the day, competition is good, but it was a transitionary period for basically everyone. Sony basically became the new like gaming destination. The PlayStation 2 is the greatest selling console of all time, and I still think it's number one. I think the DS was the only one that could maybe have caught it, and it fell like a million short. The Xbox came, so Microsoft's like, "Hey, we're willing to lose $4 billion to make this a success. We have our killer app, much like Sega just did with Sonic. They did it with Halo, and they're like, boom, now we have." There's some cool opposition to Sony. So Sony became kind of like the adult, like the teenager slash adult video game console. Microsoft was, second place there. Like, hey, here's another outlet if you don't want to buy a PlayStation. Nintendo went through their weird phase of everyone thinking that their games were kiddie and nobody wanted to buy a GameCube. And Sega just, there's too much competition, too much going against them. Near the end of the life cycle of the Dreamcast, they ended up dropping the price down to $99, which, if you got a Dreamcast for $99, then I feel like it was just a great deal. They just did like so many interesting things. Like they really tried. You know what I mean? Like they had the internet. They're I'm trying to think of what they're called. VMUs. They're memory cards plugged. They had a little screen, tiny little screen on them, and they plugged into the controller. And some of the games like do things like you could take that out and take it with you and like play little bits of games on them if you had save files for it. And then at the end of the day, it's a console that's not selling. There's no games for it, basically. I shouldn't say no games because the Dreamcast definitely has games, but it just didn't have the amount of games. Like, they weren't like Nintendo, where Nintendo could, like, hey, we have, you know, 10 different franchises we can pull from that everybody knows. And then 15 franchises after that we could technically still utilize that are like semi popular. Sony was just dominating. Everybody was releasing games for their consoles. Same thing with like Microsoft. Like if it was going to be an M-rated game, it was going on both of those. Probably not on the GameCube, and there's just no way in heck it was going on the Dreamcast. So it was a weird time because it felt like it got stuck between the sixth and seventh generation because it didn't have a lot of the seventh generation games that like were multi-plat. So, Sonic. I feel like Sonic Adventures kind of where it kind of ended. The quality and the ability for Sonic to be so well known and to like sell games I think went away at that time. And it's crazy to think of, say, Mario Kart, because that's a sales figure I have off the top of my head. 40 million copies on the Switch, Mario Kart 8, which is a port, basically. It's like an enhanced port. 40 million copies. It's just absolutely insane. And for whatever reason, Sonic was just never able to transition to 3D. So, what basically started, like I said earlier, wanting to even sit down and talk about this was I was watching Sonic Frontiers, and I the Sonic cycle is something kind of funny. It's like a meme, but basically it's like Sega. I don't know if it's like true anymore, but Sega shows some gameplay of a Sonic. Everybody gets hyped back up. They say it's going to be different this time. Then the game comes out. It gets mixed reviews, mediocre reviews, doesn't sell that great. And then basically the last step of the cycle is everybody vows to never do it again. And, it's just, I'm done with Sonic. I'm done with Sonic. Then they come back. But what's interesting is I just don't think Sonic has the sales figures to really represent like that Sonic cycle. Because you're looking at, let me take a look here. Because like I said earlier, Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games was the best-selling Sonic game, quote unquote, since the original, with 11 million copies sold. And yeah, like Sonic Adventure 2.5 million to 1.5 million, Sonic Advance 1 million. So it's like it's breaking 1 million, but you look at other sales figures from something that should be like a mascot of the hardware, and it's just not having like that much of an impact. And there's a few titles I didn't even realize that didn't even come close to breaking 1 million. So that's actually pretty interesting. So at this point, nobody from the original Sonic team or that were like involved with Sonic are there anymore. And I feel like you can sense that and feel that. But what's so funny is there is a title that came out about 5 years ago called Sonic Mania. See, I have it right here. And I remember seeing this and being like, did. Because at this point, the Sonic cycle happened a lot where they were like, we're going to bring him back to his roots with Sonic Generations, which sadly had like 3D levels that you had to play through too, which was okay. Sonic Colors was interesting, a newer experience. And, I wouldn't say they were like amazing games, but they weren't bad, which was like, something that like we just wanted to move Sonic in the right direction of like, quality games, right? And let's see, there's Sonic 4. That was one where as Sega tried to go back to Sonic's roots 1 million different times, this is why I think they lost the coding for the Genesis games, because Sonic 4 came out and everybody's like, oh, he's 2D again, it's awesome. And you play it and you're like, the platforming is so off. Like it was such a weird experience. I don't even know how to describe it, but Sonic felt like heavy and floaty at the same time. Like it just felt really awkward controlling him. And I'm like, there's no way. There have been examples of companies losing the coding to their game. Like I'm pretty sure Square Enix lost the original coding to Kingdom Hearts 1. So it's not like it's unheard of, but it's the only thing that I can think of that would have happened where, like, if you still have the coding and you can go back and reference the Genesis games, why couldn't you just take it, update the development tools and be like, all right, we're just going to make one with this and see what the heck happens. So Sonic Mania, I didn't realize at this time, wasn't even developed by Sega. And it's awesome. It looks exactly like the Genesis games. It feels exactly like the Genesis games. The music's great. Like everything is. I remember playing it and I was like, holy crap. I was like, how did Sega do this? And I was talking to one of my friends and he was like, well, they didn't make it. I was like, what? He's like, yeah, they found a guy who made like these fan made like reboots of Sonic or like redesigns or something like that. Or I'm like, wait, what? And that's basically true. There's this gentleman. It might have been like a couple people, but yeah, he essentially made Sonic Mania, but Sega like supervised it. but they requested that he like handle some of the ports and everything like that too of the Genesis games, which is just absolutely like fascinating to me. Like I just I can't believe it. But what's really funny, and maybe this isn't funny. I don't know. Maybe this is like sad for the state of um, uh, Sonic in general. Um, but it was like the best reviewed Sonic game in 15 years when it came out. Like that. Oh man. So kudos to Sega for basically saying like, hey, we don't know how he's doing this. Like, why don't we bring him in and have him do something? I think they should, continue it, even if it's a side thing. The only thing is like, it's another thing because it's probably the highest we talked about the highest rated Sonic game in 15 years, right? And it released on every single platform, but it only sold 1 million copies. So I think that really kind of puts things into perspective. So I'm really interested to see what Sonic Frontiers does because the game just doesn't look good to me. And as I was like watching it, and I definitely need to play it, but it just to be honest, based upon what I've seen, I don't know if it's a game that I want to take the time to play right now. It just I don't understand how like we're at this point now. So like I don't even know what Sonic's identity is anymore. And you look back and if you were like, "Hey, describe Sonic in the Genesis era," I'd be like, he was the embodiment of the 90s. He was edgy, he was cool, like he didn't play by the rules. He's very fast, cocky, has a sense of humor, gets the job done, like really cool. I'd probably say cool already. And if you ask me to describe Sonic now, like I don't even know what I would say, and especially after having played because I've played pretty much every every Sonic title up until this point. I have Sonic here. No, I played Sonic Heroes. I was gonna say I might not have played Sonic Heroes. I have it on the GameCube. But I do remember playing it, but it just feels like they haven't been able to kind of bring back and to be a mascot that basically made the Genesis a success and at the end of the day like made things it got Sega to where they are today. And the Sonic movies did really well and he's really well known. Like if a kid sees Sonic, there's a good chance they might know who he is. But why is that not translating like to people just buying the games? You know what I mean? Like that's kind of where I really thought in the last like 10 or 15 years that Sonic just sold a lot better. So what I thought was happening was the games are coming out, the Sonic cycle was happening, they were being mediocre, some people liked them, most people didn't. And but the fan base was still there. Like that's the one thing is like that fan base, there are still people that love Sonic and there are still people that are really like they go in depth with the Sonic lore and everything like that. But what is tricky here is that just isn't equating to like large sales of the franchise. And I'm really curious because like Sonic Frontiers, it's glitchy. The design is weird. I seeing Sonic in 3D space and like with what they're developing, it just doesn't. I don't know if it's too fast or just like too jumbled. It doesn't seem like it's easy to control him. Like the game is all glitchy. Like just everything about it is just when I still think of Sonic as like a really solid game series, and I think it's just from like the perception that I had from all of those years ago, from playing like really high quality Genesis titles, and being like, yeah, these games are freaking awesome. Because I can't tell you how many hours I put into Sonic 2 and 3, especially 3. Like I would get home sometimes and be like, I feel like playing Sonic, and I would just beat Sonic 3 in one sitting with Super Sonic. Like I would just collect all the emeralds, turn to Super Sonic, beat the game. Like psh, like I did it. And to see like where it is now, and Sonic Mania was a good throwback, but if if it was that good and it kind of went back to the roots, it's like maybe there is something to them trying to like push it forward and go to this like 3D and everything like that. Like I don't know. I don't know what the answer is for Sonic anymore. It's a series that I would still say that I like. And I miss old Sonic. I'll always like fondly remember, and there's the best way to play the Genesis games is that on a Genesis because like you don't want to lose on that Sonic 3 music either, which on the ports there was a lot of like issues with the playability of the ports, but that was another thing. They had to remove that music due to Michael Jackson's involvement, which was just a bummer because like I can't imagine playing uh, levels 4 through 6 without the original soundtracks. Like they're so ingrained into my memory that if something else is playing, I'd be like, what's this? So I don't know where Sonic goes from here. I don't know where Sega goes from here. I mean, it's Sega Sammy now, so there's a lot of other titles under their umbrella, and I think Sega as a whole does have a lot of great intellectual properties. But like, what do you do with Sonic? So like, if I give you the business magic wand, like what do you do for the series? Because if Sonic Frontiers sells well, or at least more than 1 million copies, you know what I mean? Then there's something about getting Sonic in a 3D space. But why? There are ideas in games that kind of embody the gameplay of Sonic. So the gameplay of Sonic is moving quickly through a course, right? But why can't we translate Sonic into this 3D world and make these games fun and like I just why can't we do it? And I think the secret sauce here is racing games. Now, what I'm saying is that I don't want Sega to make another Sonic racing game, but the gameplay's there. So, in something you control moving very very quickly through a course in a 3D space, racing games. Like you go through a course, you're going through fast. There's different gameplay. Like you can drift, you can do this, you can do that. Like, and they're good. So how do we kind of like take Sonic and blend him in? Not saying that it has to be put into like remove the car and put Sonic there. I'm not saying do that, but the gameplay is there for what Sonic can be in a 3D space. Like, why can't we take those ideas and blend them with the Sonic franchise and make something that just doesn't have a completely messy camera and you're like, what is going on here? Like, I barely have any control over this character. The camera's flipping around. Like, what is the point? What are we doing? So I don't know. Like, if I gave you a magic wand and said, hey, do something that fixes Sonic, what's his future? I don't know what it would be. Sonic Mania 2, but then what? It sells 1 million copies and it's just not it's just not what Sonic was anymore. It's just not a killer app. It's a good selling game, but it's not like a AAA sells game. Like you're not going to sell 15 million copies of Sonic anymore. So I don't know. It's hard for me coming from an absolute love of Sega and Sonic and seeing just like what it's become. You know what I mean? Like I don't know where you go from here, and I don't think I have the answers anymore. I think you could definitely blend some ideas and I feel like Nintendo has done a really good job with Mario of blending in the nostalgia and the people that have grew up playing Mario, but also bringing in new people to play Mario in like modern day, game styles basically. And I don't know if it's doable with Sonic anymore. I don't know what the answers are because it feels like with Frontiers coming out that it's not that. So I don't know. We'll see. But that'll kind of wrap up this podcast. I love Sonic, and I just want the best for him. I want the best for Sega. So I'm hoping they can kind of figure this out. But those are kind of my my lost memories and fond memories of the Sonic franchise and kind of thoughts on where it's at currently. But I am BigReed. I am your host. This was another episode of Gaming's Lost Memories. Please follow or subscribe so that way anytime a new podcast comes out, you can check it out. And if you have any suggestions, you can always like leave a review on topics that you would like as well. I cover pretty much anything. I've been playing video games for a long time, but thank you so much for listening. I appreciate it.